Hi, welcome to Feed Your Soul. I am Melinda, and you are watching our series on the Torah portion. This series is designed with followers of Jesus in mind, helping us Messianic or Christian believers, whatever you call yourself, helping us understand the front of our Bibles better than we do. If you're new here, please go find our playlist. We started in Genesis in the fall. We're almost halfway through the first 5 books of the Bible. Um, Understanding the teachings of Jesus and the letters of Paul and the rest of the New Testament, really understanding that well only comes after we understand the front of our Bibles better. So we are on the portion called Mitzvah, and it means something like of the leper. It's like a verb form of leprosy. And it is found in Leviticus chapters 14 and 15. This is actually the second half of what is usually a double portion. Um, and it should have taken place before Passover came. Um, I had some issues going on and I couldn't get to it. So we're just playing catch up here. So I apologize if you were waiting for this, and we're going to get caught up, get this one, and the current Torah portion of this week will be done as well. So another just point on why it sometimes is a double portion and sometimes they're spread apart into 2 separate weeks. This year we had on the rabbinical calendar, it's the Jewish biblical calendar. I say rabbinical because there are different ideas of how to walk out the biblical calendar. And the one that most people are familiar with, like if you Google when is Passover, you'll usually get the rabbinical answer. And on their calendar, they insert a leap month. We're familiar with a leap day that comes every 4 years. There's a leap month that kind of pushes the holidays up later in the year and gives us more time with the portions so we can spread them out a little bit. So if you're wondering why Passover and Easter were a little bit far apart this year, it's likely because of this leap month. I talk a little bit about calendars in the Passover video. If you're interested, we will talk more about that as other holidays come up. I don't like it when they're so far off. In my mind and in the way I celebrate in my home, it's much easier when the holidays are closer together, but we'll leave that discussion for another time. We're also going to look at Kings chapter 7 and a small part of Luke chapter 5. This shouldn't be a very long video. We'll see. I say that, and then an hour later, let's see how long we go. But before we get into the reading, I just want to talk about the root word of mitzvah. It is this word for some skin condition, but more than a skin condition, something that seems to afflict people, and it can even afflict fabrics and walls of the home, like porous structures. So it comes from a word that means to scourge. Um, it seems to be some kind of a spiritual affliction, but is it also something that is physical and communicable? It's really hard to know. What we do know is that what the Bible calls leprosy here in Leviticus is likely not the same disease there's a modern disease that has been called leprosy. It is now more clinically known as Hansen's disease. Most experts do not think it is the same thing. What is going on here in Leviticus and other places in the Bible seem to be a different affliction that oftentimes comes with judgment, but also can be retained for a long period of time and maybe even passed down generationally. Um, we don't know. And I think we just have to be okay with not knowing exactly. But we will dive in and try to understand a little bit more than maybe we did before this study. Okay, so a quick review again before we get into this week's reading. Last time we talked a lot about the idea of clean and unclean, and the connotation of that, and really that comes from the word tehor and tameh and tehor. So for unclean, tameh, and tehor, clean. And these are like ritual cleanliness. So these two words might be better associated with the idea of death and life, right? Spiritual or ceremonial uncleanliness is connected to things that are closer to death and dying, dead bodies, disease, illness. Um, After childbirth, when you're losing all of this blood, even after having relations between a man and a woman, those things are closer to death. Again, maybe not complete physical death, but some kind of cellular death, things that keep you a little bit separate from this type of presence of God. It really is about the presence of God in the specific tabernacle and then temple. The things that are associated with being ceremonially clean are the things that are more about life and restoration and being able to come closer to God again. So they are not about being right and wrong. They are not about being sinful or not having sinned. So just as we talk about these things, just keep that in mind. Um, we went over a couple weeks ago in the portion how these two ideas of like things that bring death and things that bring life really do mirror what had gone on in the garden. The tabernacle and the presence of God being there in the tabernacle really mirrors in a way the presence of God in the garden. And Adam and Eve, the people, the humans were there being able to be in a relationship with God until sin kind of separated them again, right? So now they're close, they're tameh. They have to go through a process to be able to become close to God again. And so this whole process has been happening throughout the whole Torah so far. God has made a way for his people to be close in his presence again. And instead of it being in the garden, it is now in the tabernacle. So instead of God and people sharing, like it was people sharing God's space, right? God created this garden, invited the people in. Now it's kind of flipped. And people were commanded to create the tabernacle and really as an invitation or a space for God to come in. But either way, things that are associated with death are still not allowed to come close to this type of the presence of God. And that's really what it's all about. And we'll see that actually show up in this week's portion. It really spells that out very clearly. That all of this tameh and tehor, this ritual, clean or unclean, this idea of being closer to life or death, it's really all about being able to approach the presence of God in this state, in this way, in this time period. And it's all about restoring us in right relationship with God so that for the safety really of the person approaching God in this state, in this presence, in whatever this presence was, where he dwelt in and upon the ark of the covenant that dwelt in the tabernacle in the Holy of Holies. So here we are in Leviticus 14. I just want to point out, you can see on your screen, there's an underlined phrase and a couple of bolded Hebrew words. So this portion is called mitzvah, and I butcher the pronunciation of Hebrew. I'm a Hebrew reader, but not like a Hebrew speaker. So I apologize. But it is the word that means the one with the skin disease, the verb form of like what the skin disease is. And it comes from the root word for tatzrat. Both of these words that mean the same thing, right? That's leprosy or the one with leprosy. And you'll see when it's referring to the skin disease in this version, it'll say skin disease, and it doesn't use the term leprosy. And when it applies to an object, it uses like mold or mildew. So all the same exact Hebrew root word, though. I noted a few places, especially where it really impacts the meaning. I just revert back to the Hebrew word to just remind us that there's not a different word here. It's not leprosy, mildew, skin disease, mold. It's all one word, and the word is tzatzarat, which this biblical type of leprosy or skin issue or affliction, I don't know. What do you know about this word? Have you done a word study on it? Do you have any information? Put it in the comments because we can discuss it as we go along. Okay. Then Yehovah said to Moses, "This is the law for the one with a skin disease, the mitzorah, on the day of his cleansing when he is brought to the priest. The priest is to go outside the camp to examine him. And if the skin disease, the tatzrat, or leprosy in some of your versions, of the afflicted person has healed, the priest shall order that 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, be brought to the one to be cleansed. Then the priest shall command that one of the birds be slaughtered over fresh water in a clay pot, and he is to take the live bird together with the cedar, the scarlet yarn, the hyssop, and dip them into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. 7 times he shall sprinkle the one to be cleansed of the skin disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean and release the live bird into the open field. The one being cleansed must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe with water. Then he will be ceremonially clean. Afterward, he may enter the camp, but he must remain outside his tent for 7 days. On the 7th day, he must shave off all his hair, his head, his beard, his eyebrows, and the rest of his hair. He must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day, he is to bring 2 unblemished male lambs, an unblemished ewe lamb, a year old, a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, and 1 log of olive oil. The priest who performs the cleansing shall present the one to be cleansed together with these offerings before Yehovah at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then the priest is to take one of the male lambs presented as a guilt offering along with the log of olive oil and must wave them as an offering before Yehovah. Then he is to slaughter the lamb in the sanctuary area where the sin offering is burnt. The sin offering and burnt offering are slaughtered. Like the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand and on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest shall take some of the log of the olive oil and pour it into his left palm, dipping his right forefinger into the oil in his left palm and sprinkling some of the oil with his fingers 7 times before Yehovah. And the priest is to put some of the oil remaining in his palm on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, and on top of the blood of the guilt offering. The rest of the oil in his palm, the priest is to put on the head of the one to be cleansed, to make atonement before him before Yehovah. Then the priest is to sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. After that, the priest shall slaughter the burnt offering, offer it on the altar with the grain offering to make atonement for him, and he will be clean. If, however, the person is poor and cannot afford these offerings, he is to take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to make atonement for him, along with 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, a log of olive oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, whichever he can afford, 1 to be a sin offering and 1 to be a burnt offering. On the 8th day, he is to bring them for his cleansing to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting before Yehovah. The priest shall take the lamb for the guilt offering, along with the log of olive oil, and wave them as a wave offering before Yehovah. And after he slaughters the lamb for the guilt offering, the priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest is to pour some of the oil into his left palm and sprinkle with his right forefinger some of the oil that is in his left palm 7 times before Jehovah. The priest shall also put some of the oil in his palm on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, and on the right thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot, on the same places as the blood of the guilt offering. The rest of the oil in his palm, the priest is to put on the head of the one to be cleansed, to make atonement for him before Jehovah. Then he must sacrifice the turtle doves or young pigeons, whichever he can afford, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, together with the grain offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement before Jehovah for the one to be cleansed. This is the law for someone who has a skin disease and cannot afford the cost of his cleansing. So this skin issue, this affliction, right? Some things I want to just talk about for a moment. First of all, we don't know exactly what the skin disease is. We often will think about our modern understanding of what leprosy is, this nervous degeneration of the body, where it actually doesn't like eat the flesh or anything, but what happens is you tend to get these injuries because of the nerve degeneration, and then people like you can get a burn, and you don't know it's burned, and so you wind up having all of this damage to your body. That's what the modern version of leprosy is. We don't think that's what this is happening here, but there is some kind of affliction that winds up on the skin, that is very apparent that that's what it is. The priest is charged with really the diagnoses. He's not treating what's going on in this patient, but he is the one who knows what to look for to know if it's this skin disease or not, and when he is healed from it, and when he can kind of be brought back into the community. And the other thing I wanted to point out was that there is an atonement made for this person in his ritual uncleanness. When he is tameh, right? He needs to bring, depending on how much money he has to bring a certain sacrifice, and part of that sacrifice is a guilt offering, and the priest in the tabernacle is making atonement. And I think we have to remember, when we think of atonement, we often think of taking away our sin, right? And atonement is really more than taking away bad things that we do. It's about restoring relationship. It's about restoring how close we can get with the Father. And so it's bigger than I'm not guilty of this sin anymore, because really what is necessary to have that restoration is repenting, right? Turning from your sin, confessing and repenting. Like that's how you walk away from sin. But then there is another process that allows us to become at one. There's a play on the word atonement, where it looks like at one ment with God, where we can be in a closer relationship safely, right? There was that closeness in the garden, and in order to have that relationship be close again, there is a need for this atonement. So it's deeper than I think a lot of our understanding is about that word. What does make atonement mean? It's a really complex idea. All right, so the rest of Leviticus 14, we're moving out of the skin disease portion, and we're moving into the mold and mildew portion. But remember, it's all the same Hebrew word. It is I'm going to pronounce Setzraat. It's that first letter there is like a sound, like a TZ almost, and it's so hard. It's hard to say. Tatzraat is whatever this affliction is, and it's not just something that is. It's not just for people and their skin. It is something that can happen to dwellings and fabric as well. Okay, so remember that. Okay, so Leviticus 14. Then Jehovah said to Moses and Aaron, when you enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your possession, and I put a contamination of mildew, again, same word, into a house in that land, the owner of the house shall come and tell the priest, something like mildew has appeared in my house. Something like tatzraat, leprosy has appeared in my house. The priest must order that the house be cleared before he enters it to examine the mildew, so that nothing in the house will become unclean. After this, the priest shall go in to inspect the house. He is to examine the house, and if the mildew on the walls consists of green or red depressions that appear to be beneath the surface of the wall, the priest shall go outside the doorway of the house and close it up for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to return and inspect the house. If the mildew has spread on the walls, he must order that the contaminated stones be pulled out and thrown into an unclean place outside the city. And he shall have the inside of the house scraped completely, and the plaster is scraped and dumped into the unclean place outside the city. So different stones must be obtained to replace the contaminated ones, as well as additional mortar to replaster the house. If the mildew, again, same word, um, reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house has been scraped and replastered, the priest must come and inspect it. If the mildew has spread in the house, it is a destructive mildew and the house is unclean. It must be torn down with its stones, its timbers, and all its plaster, and taken outside the city to an unclean place. Anyone who enters the house during any of the days that it is closed up will be unclean until evening. Anyone who sleeps in the house or eats in it must wash his clothes. If, however, the priest comes and inspects it, the mildew has not spread, and the mildew has not spread after the house has been replastered, he shall pronounce the house clean because the mildew is gone. He is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, hyssop, to purify the house, and he shall slaughter one of the birds over fresh water in a clay pot. And he shall take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, the live bird, dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird, and the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. And he shall cleanse the house with the bird's blood, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Finally, he is to release the live bird into the open fields outside the city. In this way, he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. This is the law for any tetzra'at, for a scaly outbreak, for tetzra'at in clothing or in a house, and for a swelling, a rash, or a spot, to determine when something is clean or unclean. This is the law regarding tetzra'at. So this, combined with the previous portion, really talks all about this clean and unclean, this affliction of a person, and then this similar to different affliction of the home, and what needs to be done about it. I'm torn between 2 ideas, that this is a spiritual thing that comes from God and really only applies to the people who are living in such close community with him. And who are living in the place where he chooses to put his name, right, when they go into the city of Canaan, and that's where his temple will be. But this is the spiritual affliction. So that's some school of thought believe that. And then there's this other school of thought that this is really just about different diseases, and it's kind of given the same name because it's like a disease of the skin, and there could be like a disease of the skin of a house. I could go either way. I think what matters most here to understand these things is that, number one, the priests were the ones who were to have the knowledge. They were to know. The lay people didn't need to know how to deal with this. They had resources, and the resource was supposed to be the priest. He was supposed to, the priesthood, were the keepers of this knowledge, the experts. And they were really supposed to be serving the people, keeping them safe, being the ones to deal with this dangerous presence of God, right? There was being this close to God, having people come into the tabernacle, approaching the presence of God. It was a dangerous business. And the priests were there to keep people safe, and really to help restore the people's closeness with God, right? So that was their duty to perform. That was their primary job, restoring right relationship with God and the people. And exactly what was going on, we don't know. But what do you think? What's going on with leprosy? Do you think it's just a spiritual affliction? Do you believe that this was a skin disease, and what we're managing here is like a communicable disease? Um, was it like a mold or a mildew, or was this something that happened that was kind of like a plague that God inflicted on the home of somebody for some reason as a consequence? What do you think? Okay, we're going to go on to Leviticus 15. Just a warning, if you have little ones hanging around, I will do my best to keep this nice and PG, but it does talk about bodily emissions and fluids, and we're continuing on the whole tahor and tameh, the unclean and clean idea. So if there's little ones around, you might want to watch this later. Honestly, we won't use too much descriptive language, so there might not be an issue, but I just wanted to give you fair warning. Okay. Leviticus 15. And Jehovah said to Moses and Aaron, say to the Israelites, when any man has a bodily discharge, the discharge is unclean. This uncleanness is from his discharge, whether his body allows the discharge to flow or blocks it. So his discharge will bring about uncleanness. Any bed on which the man with discharge lies will be unclean, and any furniture on which he sits will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he will be unclean till evening. Whoever sits on furniture on which the man with the discharge was sitting must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Whoever touches the body of the man with a discharge must wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he will be unclean until evening. If the man with a discharge spits on one who is clean, that person must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. On any saddle which the man with discharge rides will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening. Whoever carries such things must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge touches anyone without first rinsing his hands with water, the one who was touched must wash his clothes, bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Any clay pot that the man with discharge touches must be broken, and any wooden utensil must be rinsed with water. When the man, and so this was, just to pause for a moment, this discharge isn't this is some kind of illness. This is an abnormal discharge. Just to keep that in mind, right? Verse 13, when the man has been cleansed from his discharge, he must count off 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe himself in fresh water, and he shall be clean. On the 8th day, he is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons that come before Jehovah at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. The priest is to sacrifice them, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for the man before Jehovah because of his discharge. When a man has a emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which is an emission of semen must be washed with water, and it will remain unclean until evening. If a man lies with a woman and there is a emission of semen, both must bathe with water, and they will remain unclean until evening. Now we're moving on to the women. When a woman has a discharge consisting of blood from her body, she will be unclean due to her menstruation for 7 days. So normal menstruation, 7 full days. Anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything on which she lies or sits during menstruation will be unclean. And anyone who touches her bed must wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he will be unclean until evening. Whoever touches any furniture on which she is sitting must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. And whether it is a bed or furniture on which he is sitting, whoever touches it will be unclean until evening. If a man lies with her and her menstrual flow touches him, he will be unclean for 7 days, and any bed on which he lies will become unclean. When a woman has a discharge of her blood for many days, so this is beyond normal menstruation, at a time other than her menstrual period, or if it continues beyond her period, she will be unclean all the days of her unclean discharge, just as she is during the days of her menstruation. Any bed on which she lies or furniture on which she sits during the days of her discharge will be unclean, like her bed during her menstrual period. Anyone who touches these things will be unclean, and he must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean until evening. When a woman is cleansed of her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and after that, she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, she is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest is to sacrifice one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for her before Jehovah for her unclean discharge. You must keep the children of Israel separate from their uncleanness, so they do not die by defiling my tabernacle, which is among them. I feel like that is our thesis statement. This is our summary of this whole section of clean and unclean that we've been working through in Leviticus. So let's read it again. You must keep the children of Israel separate from their uncleanness, their ceremonial impurity, so that they do not die by defiling my tabernacle, which is among them. This is the law of him who has a discharge, of the man who has an emission of semen, whereby he is unclean, of a woman in her menstrual period, or any male or female who has a discharge, and of a man who lies with an unclean woman. So we see some of the same language of a guilt offering, clean and unclean, the atonement that is made, right? This writing relationship, writing, being able to be in close proximity with the Father in his presence. And then that sentence there about this is what the children of Israel must do in order to keep them safe so they do not die. And it reminds me of Nadab and Abihu, who approached the Lord and his altar with foreign fire, with something that was not in the instructions. And we don't know what else maybe they didn't abide by, but they were immediately killed. We look at all these instructions and we wonder why, or we think this is too much, or we think it was just this rigid religiosity. But we see here, right here in Leviticus 15, that God says it so the people can approach and not die. We have to remember the creator of all things is pretty mighty. His ways are higher than our ways. We don't even know. And here he is limiting himself, bringing his power as close as he can to his people. And he's saying here, so that I can be close and so that you aren't harmed, here are the things that need to happen. And it can remind us of the awe that we should have about the presence of God, the respect, just how different we are than the creator of the universe, right? His ways are higher than our ways. He is God, we are not. And he has made a way for us to restore closeness with him through the work of Jesus. Jesus is the one providing our atonement. He's the one doing this work of the priesthood now, right? He's the one who goes before the Father, who provides that intermediary atonement for us. He is the one. And we are able to approach God in the spiritual sense because of the work that Yeshua has done and is continually doing for us. And then we will be able to do that in a physical sense in the kingdom come. Because of the work of Yeshua, of Jesus, we will have restored supernatural bodies who are unable to become unclean, right? That's what the resurrection brings us. That's what heaven really is all about, is about the rebirth. That's what being born again really is. That's what salvation really is, being saved from the second death, being restored, brought back, reborn into our perfect, uncorruptible flesh. That won't be able to sin purposefully and won't be able to become unclean again. And so that there will be no interruption for our fellowship with the Father. I find it really cool when we're able to connect these things, right? What this priesthood was doing here at this point in time and what Jesus has done and is doing for us right now before the Father. So there is another, last time we looked at Naaman and his leprosy and how that was handled. And this week we are looking at Uzziah and the way the leprosy was handled here. And so these stories have very different endings. So if you didn't watch the last portion, go watch that. Check out the story about Naaman and Elisha, and then compare and contrast with Second Chronicles. So if you really want to get the whole story, always read in context, read a little bit more of the story before and after chronologically. But here we are, Second Chronicles 26. This isn't necessarily the traditional prophet pairing. A lot of times there is in the Torah portions a very traditional pairing that goes along with it. This one just fit well. Sometimes I choose the traditional one, sometimes I pick the one I want. So, okay. Second Chronicles 26. All the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in place of his father Amaziah. Uzziah was the one who rebuilt Eloth and restored it to Judah after King Amaziah rested with his fathers. Uzziah was 16 years old when he became king and reigned in Jerusalem 52 years. His mother's name was Jechaliah. She was from Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the eyes of Jehovah, just as his father Amaziah had done. He sought God throughout the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. And as long as he sought Jehovah, God gave him success. Uzziah went out to wage war against the Philistines, and he tore down the walls of Gath, Jabneh, and Ashdod. Then he built cities near Ashdod and among the Philistines. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabs living in Gerbal and against the Meunites. The Amorites brought tribute to Uzziah, and his fame spread as far as the borders of Egypt, for he had become exceedingly powerful. Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, the valley gate, and the angle in the wall, and he fortified them, since he had much livestock in the foothills and in the plain. He built towers in the desert and dug many cisterns. And since he was a lover of the soil, he had farmers and vine dressers in the hill country and in the fertile fields. Uzziah had an army ready for battle that went out to war by assigned divisions, as recorded by Jael, the scribe, and Messiah, sorry, the officer, under the direction of Hananiah, one of the royal officers. The total number of family leaders of the mighty men of valor was 2,600. Under their authority was an army of 307,500 trained for war, a powerful force to support the king against his enemies. Uzziah supplied the entire army with shields, spears, helmets, armor, bows, slingshots. And in Jerusalem, he made skillfully designed devices to shoot arrows and catapult large stones from the towers and corners. So his fame spread far and wide, for he was helped tremendously, so that he became powerful. But when Uzziah grew powerful, his arrogance led to his own destruction. He was unfaithful to Jehovah his God, for he entered the temple of Jehovah to burn incense on the altar of incense. Then Azariah, the priest, along with 80 brave priests of Jehovah, went in after him. They took their stand against King Uzziah and said, Uzziah, you have no right to offer incense to Jehovah. Only the priests, the descendants of Aaron, are consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have acted unfaithfully. You will not receive honor from Jehovah, your God, Jehovah Elohim. Uzziah, with a censer in his hand to offer incense, was enraged. But while he raged against the priests in their presence in the house of Jehovah before the altar of incense, leprosy broke out on his forehead. When Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests turned to him and saw his leprous forehead, they rushed him out. Indeed, he himself hurried to get out because Jehovah had afflicted him. So King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He lived in isolation, leprous and cut off from the house of Jehovah, while his son Jotham had charge of the royal palace to govern the people of the land. As for the rest of the acts of Uzziah from beginning to end, they are recorded by the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. And Uzziah rested with his fathers and was buried near them in a field of burial that belonged to the kings. For all the people said he was a leper. And his son Jotham reigned in his place. So here's a realistic rendering of the priest and King Uzziah being stricken with leprosy. No, but really, this should again harken us back to this, what happened with the incense, right? So here it happens again, where Uzziah, in his arrogance, performed a duty that wasn't his to perform. He's breaking protocol. He is not functioning and approaching God in the way that God has outlined very clearly. And we know that it was pride, right? And this really does mirror what Aaron's sons, if you want to look at that story, go back quite a few portions at this point. It was heartbreaking to see what happened with Aaron's sons. This idea that we don't have to do it God's way, that we know better, that we're powerful, that nothing can touch us, right? I think that is the idea that tends to still afflict the hearts of many believers, that we know better. We know better than what the word says. We know better than what God thinks. And then we try to approach him our own way, or we try to handle the situation our own way and not the way prescribed by him. How often are we guilty of what King Uzziah was guilty of here? This pride, this arrogance. So we see here that this was, again, something that it was an affliction. It was given by God, right? Uzziah was approaching God in his presence in a way that he was not supposed to be. And so he wound up with leprosy until the day he died. We might not be stricken with a disease that we can see in our flesh when we have these same arrogant ideas about how we approach God, but that disease really can infect us below the surface. Arrogance, pride, a lack of humility, thinking we know better, not being able to admit when we're wrong, not being able to have a repentant heart. These are all things that are quite spiritually infectious. So this is what I take from this story, is how am I approaching God? Is it how I think I should approach him, or is it how he set up and outlined a way for me to become close with the creator of the universe? Okay, Luke 5, just a few verses. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell face down and begged him, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. Do not tell anyone, Jesus instructed him, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering Moses prescribed for your cleansing as a testimony to them. But the news about Jesus spread all the more, and great crowds came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. Yet he frequently withdrew to the wilderness to pray. So we often see Jesus performing these acts of healing, right? I believe part of this was to show that he was much more powerful than a priest or a prophet, right? The priests only had the ability to assess what was going on. Do you have leprosy? Do you not? Are you clean? Are you ready for your cleansing ritual? Yeshua, our Messiah, he had the ability to make people clean. And then they just needed to go show up at the temple for the ceremony, right? It is the faith. There's this belief, there's this commonality of people saying, I know you can do this. Will you do this? And then he says, yes, right? He doesn't say it here, but in many of the last portion, he told the man, your faith has made you well. He says it to the woman with the issue of blood, daughter, your faith has made you well. This belief that he can restore us to what we are supposed to be. That's part of what faith is, right? Knowing that you can, even if you don't, I know that you can. And if you don't, I'll assume it's for another reason that I am unable to know, but I know that you can. I love that kind of faith and this idea that this restoration, this what is taking place, people have the afflictions, whether spiritual, whether physical, whether it is just a natural state of being, right? Like in the previous portion, it was about childbirth. But childbirth involves all kinds of cellular death, right? And in this portion, it was about menstruation or a discharge or a seminal emission, right? All of these things, they're not wrong, but they don't represent this fullness of life in what we were intended to be. This portion is what makes me think that there was no intention to procreate in the garden. When people were in that type of communion with God, he was creator, and he wasn't going to partner with people to create until they had left the garden. Because how could there have been a cycle and emissions and things like that would have created a sense of uncleanness? So it is my theological belief that there was no state of separation in the garden, and that is the idea that we're going back to, that our Messiah has created a way. He is the eternal high priest. These are the threads in these series. We pull them through from the beginning of Genesis all the way through, and one of those threads is the priesthood. And this priesthood really points to Jesus being the eternal high priest, that with the incorruptible body, and he will never have to make an atonement for himself, right? Because he was the sinless one, and he's the one who makes the atonement to the Father on our behalf. And he creates that oneness with the Father that we had to leave behind when we left the garden. So that's this week's portion. I feel like we maybe left some questions unanswered. We don't know exactly what leprosy is. We do know that there are a lot of really good scientific reasons for the laws that were given, the instructions that God gave us all throughout the Bible. As we're reading through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, it's amazing how much modern science has been able to kind of give us good human reasoning that we can understand, to be like, hey, this is a good idea, right? We saw that with the laws about food. Why certain food was considered unclean and certain food was considered clean, really has good scientific reasoning. Sometimes we can't see the exact science, right? In the Word of God. The Word of God is not a science book. The two don't conflict, but we don't always understand the connection. And so sometimes we just have to know this is what he said, and it's good and it's true and it's right. And we don't have to understand it completely. And that's okay. If God tells us to do something, we know that we can trust it to be good. So If you have any questions, comments, thoughts about any of these last two portions, about childbirth, about clean and unclean, about um, the the laws of nida, which is the Hebrew term for menstruation period, about emissions or leprosy, or was leprosy of the skin the same affliction that was on the walls of the house? I don't know. But put it in the comments. Let's talk about it and share this video. If it blessed you, if you enjoyed it, if you want to share it with a friend, put it on your social media. Let's help this channel grow, because the more people who view in a given time, the farther this channel reaches, and the more people we can help educate them on the whole Word of God. And we can do this together. So remember, if you have any questions on portions of scripture that you're reading, let me know, put them in the comments, because if I don't know the answer, I will find as good an answer as I possibly can, and we'll probably address it in a further video. So let's make this a collaboration where we discuss and debate and share and bless each other like the body should, right? So if you're watching this on Sabbath, happy Sabbath, Shabbat Shalom. Keep an eye out for the next Kari, am I saying this right? A Karimot is the current portion that we should be getting to this week, and you'll see it soon, hopefully tomorrow. And on that note, have a great weekend. See you next time.